All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the exotic forest pest educator with Purdue University's Department of Entomology, and this is our final session of the fall 2025 semester of the Emerald Ash Borer University. And today we are hosting Dr. Dave Coyle from the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation at Clemson University. He's going to be talking to us a little bit about expectations for managing invasive species, and I, for one, have been looking forward to this talk quite a bit. So, with no further ado, Dave, please take it away.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, we are going to talk about, as Bob said, realistic expectations. I think a lot of times, as invasive species, stewards and managers, we get hung up on can we eradicate it, and we sometimes get pigeonholed into that's our only option. But I think there's a lot of different realistic management scenarios that are successful, and I think it does us some good to look at those in their entirety. And some of these are more appropriate than others in certain cases. So let's get going here. First, little disclaimer, you guys. If any of you have seen me talk, I have some stories, and I will get you some stories here and there. But when I've got actual data, you will see that that's data. So this disclaimer out of the way, let's start with the basics. How do we get invasive species, right? The short answer is we buy stuff, right? If we never bought stuff, we would never have invasive species, but that's just simply not how the world works. At this point, there's a whole bunch of great data out there that essentially shows you as more stuff comes in to the US, to our ports, port systems, we get more pests. There are more records of invasive species, non-native species. It's just a really tight link between volume of stuff coming in and the amount of different things that get here. We are a global economy, as we know. There's trillions of dollars of imports every year. This is just the latest from 24. And if you look on this map, a couple things I want to point out. The bigger the arrow, the more stuff is moving. And if that arrow is green, we're pushing it out. If it's red, it's coming in. So the two big green arrows you see here, which should hopefully surprise no one, we send the most stuff to Canada and Mexico, right? And then the biggest red arrow coming in is, I'm sure you can all guess, from China, right? We get tons of stuff from China. That little made in China sticker is on so many things for lots of different reasons. But from an ecological perspective, this is important because if you look at the world vegetation zones, this is basically just looking at types of trees that are out there, the climate that is in that area. It is very similar in the southeastern US and then moving up the mid-Atlantic with that same part of China. So what this essentially means, especially for the eastern US, when stuff comes in from China and it gets off that ship or that plane or what have you, it's going to find a fairly similar environment to what it had back home. It might not be the exact same species of tree, but it's probably going to be the same genus, right? It might not be the same oak, but it's a type of oak, or the same pine, it might be a type of pine. And then as you work your way up, even you can see this is Canada gets a lot of invasive things from Europe and Russia and some of those colder climates, and even going down to the Pac Southwest, that's where they have that drier climate, which makes them susceptible to a lot of Mediterranean type things. So all of these things sort of fit together that when things get here and they happen to get off, they have a likely chance or a higher likelihood of actually establishing. So going back to how do we get these invasive? Stuff gets bought, stuff gets shipped, right? We inspect stuff and they inspect a lot of things, and sometimes they find these pests. There's a lot of great people with the Customs and Border Patrol and APHIS, and they're working very hard to try to find pests on all these commodities coming in. They do a good job. They find thousands of things every year. Some of these have the potential to be really bad, some are not, but they're not from here, so we hold those out. So there's a lot of good work being done here. That said, sometimes we don't find those pests, right? This is inevitable just based on the amount of stuff coming in all the time. And some of these pests are going to get away, right? And some of them are going to get established. Now, certainly not every pest that comes here gets away, and not every pest that comes here gets established. When we think about something like the emerald ash borer, this is a problem because when it got here, there was either a gravid female or enough beetles to start a population. And I think one of the key things is there has to be enough of a non-native species coming in to start a population for it to really be a big deal, right? If we only received a male emerald ash borer back in the mid 90s, we wouldn't even be having this conversation because that population never happens, right? But if you get enough to start a population, some of these things are bad, right? And then if these bad things get established, that's when we have a situation that we have to deal with. Plants is a little different. It's a little more straightforward because they're frankly not quite as sneaky, right? We get non-native plants here because people want them. They want to buy that thing from wherever because it's prettier. They saw it in a magazine, or sometimes it is by accident. Some of these more famous non-native plants were brought in on purpose, for forage or for packaging material. And then when that plant escapes cultivation or confinement, that is when we get that situation. So it's just a little more straightforward. And there's lots of inspections for plants as well, the whole thing. So once we have a situation, management and mitigation are going to come next, right? That's when we have to start doing something about the deal we have. And so from a scientific perspective, it's imperative that scientists work with managers. We have to work together. We're a team with a shared goal of reducing invasive species impacts. The goal is successful management and mitigation, but, and this brings me to the central sort of question of this whole hour, we're going to talk about what is success, right? What is success for invasive species management? That is such a big nebulous question that there's a whole series of TED Talks simply talking about what is success. There's all sorts of different definitions for success, and it varies based on kind of what the where you are, what is the problem, all these things. So just like with anything, success sometimes is very easy to define. Full disclosure, I went to Iowa State and I'm a big Iowa State basketball fan. So this weekend we had success, right? It was a great weekend for us, and success for your team when they win is very easy to measure. Okay, this is easy. Other times, success is not easy to measure. Okay, so these are our dogs, Luna and Poppy. I have worked tirelessly with them to try to make sure that when a new person comes to the house, they don't stick their nose in that new person's crotches away to say hello. I know they're trying to be friendly, but honestly, that is just not what I'm trying to have happen here. What is success? Success to me is just them not doing that. Do I expect it to happen every time? Gosh, it'd be great. Does it happen every time? Of course not. There's blips when they get too excited and all that. So success is relative as well. And so then we look at what types of success do we have for invasive species management? I thought about it. I think there's really 6 main different types of success that we should accept, right? So first is improving our detection capabilities, and we'll go through each of these separately. Simply documenting the occurrence and impacts of a pest is a success. Sometimes it's getting people to not do something is the most successful thing we can do. Complete eradication, of course, is probably the main success story that we're all after for invasive species, but quite frankly, this does not happen a whole lot. Holding the line, not letting that species move more than it already is. And then at the end of the day, all of our goal is to develop these effective management strategies for a particular pest in a particular place so that we can give those strategies to land managers and landowners and homeowners and help them, do better by their property and what they're after. So let's go through some of these. Improving detection capabilities. So this is a pallet, right? We've all seen a pallet. There's lots of solid wood packing material. These are just big chunks of wood that are used to hold commodities or brace commodities or just stabilize things as they're going from one country to another. Well, when you look at a pallet, and for someone like me who works in wood boring pests, right, beetles and other things that like to bore inside the wood, the life of a pallet is actually quite complicated when you start from the tree that it grew in all the way to the point when it gets destroyed. And when you lay all that out, these are all the different places in the life cycle of a pallet. There's way more than I thought they were when we started this project a few years ago. And what we did in this particular project is identify all the places on that pallet's lifetime where it could be infested by something non-native that bores into it, or infested by something non-native that just sort of climbs onto it. And there's a lot of spots on here where that pallet is susceptible. There's a lot of places where it could get something. And this just shows that there's a lot of places in this pallet's life cycle where it needs to be inspected or where there needs to be some sort of mitigation that happens to try to make sure it's clean as it moves forward. much more complicated than you think. And this is just one example, right? So this is one of these things, just identifying where the weak links is going to help our surveyors. Another type of success is simply documenting the fact that it's here. Here it is, and what does it do? This is one of the things that is challenging for a lot of pests. You heard about elm zigzag sawfly a couple of weeks ago by Dr. Oaten. We're not going to go too deep into it. This is a non-native sawfly, pretty easy to ID. It's got a fairly distinct larval feeding pattern. There's all the little larvae right there. But what I think is interesting is when you look at the map of documented EZS detections in the U.S., the red, it starts out pretty small. There's not many red counties there, right? But as time has gone from 2020 all the way to 2025, there's a lot more orange, and then there's more yellow counties. Now there's more green counties. And that's because people are getting better, I think, at understanding that this is a problem. Here's what it looks like, and then subsequently reporting it. So this program has done a great job just getting people aware of this pest and making sure they are looking for it in the right place at the right time, and then reporting that in the right way to so we know where this thing is. And that brings us to the Joro spider. So those of you that may be from the Southeast, you are likely familiar with this relatively new invasive species here in North America, native to Asia. It probably got here, excuse me, around 2010 as a stowaway. So when this big new spider came, and this is a spider on my hand, they get to be about inch and a half long just on their body, and they can be, 3 to 4 inches almost with the leg spread on some of these big girls. Those are the females, by the way. The males are these teeny tiny little brown ones. When these first arrived, some would say this is great news. Right now we have a new spider that's going to eat all these bad things, and it's going to help with biocontrol and all this thing. And I would counter with saying this depends on your perspective, right? This cartoon is one of my favorites. This is a couple adults that put this mobile in front of their baby, and what they see is all these cute little animals spinning around. But from the perspective of the baby, all it sees are butts, right? So way less cute looking up at that thing. And that's what I kind of use that parallel with spiders. Like, yeah, spiders are going to eat a bunch of stuff, right? But they also completely push out a lot of the native spiders that would have been there anyway. These are some data from some of our surveys. You see the big bar on the left, that is the abundance of Joro spiders. And then all those tiny bars going to the right are all the native spiders who are almost non-existent where you have high Joro populations. And there's a lot of different orb-weaving spiders. This is a type of spider, if you think of Charlotte and Charlotte's Web, they make those great big round webs. This is that type of spider where you have a lot of Joro spiders. We see a big, a decline in the native spiders there. It's not that there wouldn't be spiders there. It's that they've kind of pushed out the native ones. So yeah, they're eating, some of the brown marmorated stink bugs and spotted lanternflies and anything you could think of. But at the end of the day, Joro spiders, like all spiders or most spiders, are indiscriminate, non-discriminate. They're going to eat whatever flies into that web. So having a whole bunch of these is not great from an ecological perspective, especially. And so we've worked hard to get people to document just the spread of these spiders, right? You remember I mentioned this is a relatively new invasive species we have here. It was first discovered in 2014 in North Georgia, just outside Athens, where the University of Georgia is. It had likely been there since about 2010 or so. And this is going up to 2003. We can see it spreading. We've done some modeling work that shows more or less the entire eastern part of the continent is probably fair game in terms of where could this spider establish in terms of the temperature and the weather. Doesn't matter if you use our model, doesn't matter if you use another model. They all pretty much show that most of the eastern U.S. is probably going to be fair game for these things. And even if we look at current populations, there's little spots, there's a population in Boston, population in Philadelphia, population in Baltimore. And you can see, you're starting to see some of these spots spread out of that central pocket right there in the Southeast. So clearly these things are moving. And again, remember, we're talking here about improving detection and getting people to report. One of the cool things we've started doing, led by the University of Georgia, is this Joro Watch. And this is led by Chuck Bargeron's team down there at the Bugwood Center in Tifton. And every week, or for 1 week of every year, we blast out a bunch of media to get people to encourage them to report these Joro spiders. And because of these reportings, we've had a lot of really, really great data come in as to where the spider is. We've found different counties, we've found new states. It's been incredibly, incredibly successful, in part because these spiders are so easy to identify, right? They're these great big things with yellow and gray stripes. One thing we've got to be cognizant of, and one thing we put a lot of effort in, is teaching people what is a Joro spider and what is not a Joro spider. Here in the Southeast, we've got a couple other big yellow spiders, as we call them. The banana spiders are incredibly similar to Joros, same genus. One of the big differences is those banana spiders have what looks like little fuzzy leg warmers on their legs, and they don't have stripes, they have spots. The other big yellow spider we deal with is the garden spider, and the easy way to look at this is that's got that white zigzag that goes right down the middle of their web. So we work hard to tell people what is a Joro spider and what is not a Joro spider. And in return, we ask them to report those. It's been incredibly successful. Another type of success is simply stopping people from doing something. Okay. Bamboo. I think bamboo is one of the two worst plants in the world. We will talk about another one in a little bit, but I will admit that in some cases, bamboo is fine, right? So this is a restaurant near where I live. It's got about a 3 foot by a 3 foot wide chunk of dirt, and they've put bamboo in there just to give a little shade and a little structure. Bamboo primarily spreads by roots. It rarely seeds. So in this case, that bamboo is pretty much trapped. It's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to spread. It's not really going to do anything. This is going to be fine, from an ecological perspective. Now, when it is not contained like that, it is not okay. You get these great big dense stands that essentially crowd out all the other plants. I call them ecological dead zones. There's not really birds. There's not even mosquitoes almost. It's just like there's nothing inside these really, really dense bamboo stands down here in the Southeast. That said, bamboo grows great in a hot, humid climate. And so there are, not just this one, but there are several companies that promote bamboo growing as a crop, saying, there's 70 plus uses for it. It grows faster than trees. It grows faster than everything. And you can have this crop of bamboo in 2 to 3 years. You've got a harvestable crop. And while that may be the case, we do not have the infrastructure down here in this part of the world, in North America really at all, to handle large scale bamboo production. And part of the problem with this is that when bamboo gets planted, there's often not a really good exit strategy, right? I mean, if you're going to plant bamboo, you have to know what happens when you're done with it, because if not, you're going to go back to that really thick, dense stand. So when we see things like this, especially as extension professionals, gosh, my first inclination is just like, please don't do that, right? Don't take this super invasive, highly, high growth, non-native thing and plant it on purpose. Like there's enough of it out there already, so please don't do that. Paulownia, or the empress tree, is another one that's very similar like this. It's got these big, pretty flowers that are quite showy. It grows super fast, but it's also been shown to be quite invasive. The seeds will spread and they will just, where there are plantings of this, you'll see seedlings out on the ground. And of course, because of that, there are companies that are promoting the growth of Paulownia because of carbon sequestration and timber production and all that type of things. It's the exact same thing. We go through this every few years where some of these things pop up, and we have to do a whole bunch of work to try to get people to not grow these things. And then fortunately, we can move on, but it always seems to happen. So don't grow Paulownia, don't grow bamboo. Thank you for my TED Talk. Another type of success is just eradicating something, right? And this is what we're probably most familiar with as invasive species managers. It can be done in some cases. Okay, so here's just a couple examples. The red palm weevil. This is one of the colored morphs. This is one that has flared up a couple times in California. These are great big weevils. So there's that other color morph down there in the lower left corner, and there's those big old grubs that come with this thing. And so they'll pretty much hollow out and just destroy the inside of that palm, cabbage palms, and a lot of different types of palms. They kill the tip, and when you kill the tip of the palm, as you can see on the left, the whole thing just sort of flails down because it's dead at that point. That picture on the right, you see a healthy palm right in the front, and then 1, 2, 3 palms that are dead or dying kind of right behind it. You can see it's like the hair goes flat, right? The hair stops standing up and it just goes flat. That's a dead palm. That is all from that palm weevil. And so this can be eradicated, and they did this. Dr. Mark Cottle out there in California led this effort a while ago. This is a Laguna Beach, which is just south of LA. Took about 4 years, it's over, cost over $1 million. They only ended up finding a couple palms that had weevils in them. But they, to actually do this and ensure that it's eradicated, there was a lot of inspections, lots of costs for trapping, for detection, for monitoring, all that type of thing. But it can be done, right? It can be done, and they did it. Unfortunately, there's the South American palm weevil. It's another Rinca forest species that is still sort of festering out there in Southern California. They are still working on that similar type of deal. The giant African land snail, I was telling Bob about this earlier. I was fortunate enough to visit Florida. They have some of those, and here's one of the shells. This is a adolescent at best. They get much larger, as you see in that picture. These things flare up. Florida's had several different spots of these. It's been eradicated before, but they're currently working on this again in a couple places. Eradicating snails, I mean, make your jokes about just salting them. They're not that hard to kill. They're incredibly hard to find when they get established in a place because they'll get in all the nooks and crannies. In some cases, some of these infestations are in places that are really hard to get to. There might be, they're in big cities. There might be a lot of homeless people. There might be a lot of other factors that make it not very safe for government officials to go in and do some management. So when these things get established, it gets very tricky as well. Which brings me to the Asian longhorn beetle. So this is a pest that I work on quite a bit. It's been established in North America for nearly 30 years at this point. We got our infestation in South Carolina. We found it in May of 20. There's the house where it was found, and here's that initial tree. We found it. It's down by Hollywood, not the Hollywood you think of. Anytime I tell people I'm going to Hollywood for work, it's a very different vibe than you see on the postcards. But just south of Charleston, South Carolina is where we have this. We also have Asian longhorn beetle up there in Ohio and in a couple spots still in the Northeast as well. It's a kind of a standard cerambycid beetle as far as they go. The adults are inch and a half long. They will chew these pits, the females will, and she'll whip around and shove an egg in there. And then you'll see these up and down the trees. Once those eggs hatch, the larvae start feeding on the phloem. And this is primarily maple trees. That phloem bleeds black, and then eventually that larva turns and goes straight inside, feeds on the wood, and pushes out a bunch of sawdust and frass. It looks something like this. This is where the damage occurs because that larva more or less Swiss cheeses the entire stem and branches. Everything over an inch or so in diameter gets Swiss cheesed, which causes a couple things. The tree can't move water like it normally does, so it gets weak and eventually dies, but also you're subject to a lot of breakage, especially down here where we get these tropical storms and hurricanes coming in. Every time a big storm goes, stuff falls. This is that branch in my hand on the left, and you can see with these arrows, these are all the larval galleries that were made in that branch. So you can see it completely degrades the structure of the tree. Now, the good news is you can eradicate ALB, and we're working hard toward it. It's kind of a blunt force type of deal. You cut the tree down, you shove it through a chipper, which kills the larvae and removes the host and does a great job. But as you might guess, you can't do that in all places. So while this is the standard management for Asian longhorn beetle, and it's worked everywhere else in North America, this is the type of environment we're looking at down here in South Carolina. There's a lot of swamps, right? And so there's a lot of trees. All these trees with X's are infested red maples that have to come out of that swamp. And in completely perpetuating southern swamp stereotypes, yes, there are venomous snakes. Yes, there are alligators, and these all have to be, dealt with. You can't just send people in to survey when it's alligator mating season because they get aggressive, and you have to have everyone be prepared with their snake boots on and all this. So, not to mention, you can't get those big pieces of equipment into a swamp. They're too heavy and it would never work. So a while ago, we thought about, well, what if we just cut these trees down and let them rot on their own? Would they rot faster than the beetles would develop? Or could we just kill them standing and think, will the tree die soon enough or before that beetle, would make it? This is science, right? We're trying to figure out new management tactics for a pest. So we've got that, and Abby Ratcliffe with NC State, she did a great first study where she did this. She treated some trees with herbicide and left them standing dead. We cut some down and put them on the ground, cut some down and cut them up. What we ended up learning was that the ones on the ground, no ALBs came out of those, right? So we've got a lot of progress here. This was sort of a preliminary study. So Courtney Johnson, she's working with myself or working with me and Dr. Oten there at NC State. She's doing this even more so operational scale. So this is what one of her sites looks like, where we just send a crew in, they cut the maples down, and then they walk away. Of course, we don't just walk away. We measure all the, how many beetles are there before, how many beetles are there after, and she's done a ton of great work on all of this. We're super, super excited about this work for a couple of reasons. One, Courtney learned that ALB prefers to oviposit on vertical material. So if the log is like this, they're less likely to lay an egg on it than if it's like this, right? The other reason is just that down here in this climate, things decompose quickly, really, really quickly. And so it really appears that when you put these trees on the ground, they rot faster than the beetle larvae can feed on them. And it seems like we're not confirmed yet, but I feel really good about this as a management tactic we can use. Holding the line. Okay, so here's another one where we work really hard with states around us. Kogon grass is probably the third worst, plant pest we have in this part of the world. All sorts of things you can say about it, but I would describe it as the perfect weed, right? It's invasive everywhere, found all over. It was brought here on purpose twice. First as a packing material, and then they purposely brought it in as a forage. Sadly, they didn't check to see if animals would eat it first. They don't. And now it's just kind of all over. So you get these great big patches of it, flowers, lots of seeds per plant. It grows these really, really sharp rhizomes. And these things have been known to pop the side of a plastic kiddie pool. We've grown them in a kiddie pool. They will grow and just pop right through those things. So they're pretty aggressive that way. Biology-wise, like I said, the perfect weed. It's good in high light, low light, high moisture, drought, fire adapted. It doesn't seem to matter. It tends to do pretty well. And then when you look at where is Kogon grass at a regional level, Alabama is completely lit up. Florida is completely lit up. But look at Georgia, right? It just has a kind of that southwest corner is pretty lit up, but the rest of it is in pretty good shape, which protects the Carolinas quite well also. It's not that Kogon grass is not growing there because the environment's not right. The environment's great for it. The difference is the Georgia Forestry Commission has one guy, Mark McClure, whose whole job is to kill Kogon grass. And I've maintained for years that Mark's and the Georgia Forestry Commission's efforts have basically served as a buffer to the Carolinas for Kogon grass for years now. He's got a lot of spots in Georgia and he monitors every one of them, but you notice he keeps it down there on the Alabama side and then on the Florida side, and it keeps the rest of that state pretty clear to where we have very few Kogon grass spots in South Carolina. It's a great, great deal. He does this despite the fact that every time a big storm moves through, you get Kogon grass getting blown up into these other counties. It happened after Michael, happens after all the hurricanes. He manages to keep that thing in check, and he's even had no new Kogon grass detections near South Carolina in 24. So kudos to him for, that is holding the line in the best sense of the word. All right, and finally, developing effective management strategies. This is what, those of us that do applied work, this is, I think, where it's, when we can figure something out to give to a manager and a grower, it makes you really proud that we're doing something good that people can use. So this is the goal, I think, for a lot of invasive species folks. And we've done several things in our lab to this end. First of all, first we started with the non-native olives. Now, these things are Elaeagnus species. There's several different species out there. The common names are autumn olive and Russian olive and thorny olive. These were once planted for wildlife. They've got those fleshy fruits that a lot of things like. They're fast growing, tolerant of basically everything. And they spread both through stem sprouts and animals, eating the seed and flying away and pooping or crawling away and pooping, and then new plants will grow up. When Dr. Molly Dar was here, this was a few years ago as a postdoc, One of her projects was to coordinate with Audubon SC and see if we could basically rehabilitate this chunk of land that you see right here. Orangeburg is just kind of in the middle of the state, just between Columbia and Charleston, but there's lots of Elaeagnus there. It's a primarily pine stand, but there's a lot of hardwoods that are trying to get in there, but there's just this big, big cover of Elaeagnus all over the place. So from a management perspective, we were just going at it very simply. We used triclopyr, which is a chemical that is very commonly used, a common herbicide, great on woody invasives. And we just tried to figure out which application method is the fastest, easiest, and cheapest, right? So your options for something like this is spray it foliar, cover the leaves, and then it soaks in and kills them that way. Spray the called a basal bark treatment, where you spray the bottom 12 to 24 inches, and then it soaks in and goes down the roots that way. Or what we call a cut stump, where you actually cut the plant and then treat that little that stump that's left over. All three of these will kill the plant. The whole goal being, how can we reduce the biomass of Elaeagnus based on these three? And what we saw was a little surprising. The basal bark and cut stump worked great, not surprising there. But the foliar spray did practically nothing from a biomass perspective, which was really confusing at first until we looked back at how Elaeagnus grows. And this thing grows a big stalk up, and then those stalks sort of fold over. And what you end up getting is this umbrella type growth. And with that much Elaeagnus in there, the whole thing was just basically a big umbrella. So when you sprayed the foliar application, really all you were doing was just spraying off the top umbrella layer. The rest of it grew up underneath, and it ended up being no better than just doing nothing. So we learned a lot here. I know it seems like it's kind of a simplistic thing, and it is, but we know now that if you're going to control Elaeagnus or any type of woody shrub that has that type of growth pattern, foliar is not the way to go, right? You got to get in there and you've got to get your insect or your herbicide on the stems or on the cut stumps. When you compare the basal bark and the cut stump, we also know that cut stump is a lot more work. You're cutting those things off, you're moving them, then you're treating, you're basically on your knees the whole time. Basal bark treatment, you're just spraying those little, spray the bottom of them and walk away, and it dies and it's gone. So we've sort of learned just from this fairly simplistic, straightforward thing, basal bark is going to be the most effective, cheapest, and fastest way to do this. So let's now talk about calorie pear. Excuse me, otherwise known as Bradford pear, Pyrus caloriana. This is public enemy number one from a plant perspective, in my opinion. So here is the standard Bradford pear. I will acknowledge it has very pretty flowers, but those of you who have been around Bradford pear when it is blooming know it has, or calorie pear for that matter, it has a fairly distinct odor. There's lots and lots of different descriptions for that odor. My favorite is this: smells like rotting fish and semen, from someone in Business Insider back in 2013. That's a great description of the scent this thing gives off. Now, calorie pear was brought a long time ago. It was brought in for horticultural purposes. It had fire blight resistance, and at the time, this is around 1900, there was a burgeoning pear industry in the U.S. Pyrus communis, European pears, are what we grow food pears on. And they were getting attacked by fire blight, which is this bacterial disease that kills the stems, the end of the stem and the fruit. Pyrus caloriana has resistance. So they brought these in to try to graft communis onto caloriana to try to make a resistant selection. In doing so, that worked, right? So now we've got a pear industry. But they also found a couple of selections that looked like they'd be good in horticultural, in the horticultural realm. They grew pretty flowers, pretty red foliage. They didn't have thorns. They were resistant to all sorts of stuff. And one of these particular trees they called the Bradford pear. A man named John Creech is the guy that first did this. This was then marketed as, this awesome new horticultural urban tree. It was planted all over the place. It won awards, all of this type of thing. That said, for all the pros people gave to Bradford pear, there were some negatives, right? So we know that after about 25, 30 years old, because of how this thing grows, the branch structure was absolutely abysmal. And, a heavy rain would make these things snap, a heavy snow, ice, wind. If you looked at it wrong, they would break. One of my favorite Twitter comments, a good fart will snap one of these. And I think that's fairly accurate. They're just really, really weak in terms of their branch structure. So they knew that, but they still marketed it. A lot of money coming in. It was also marketed as a sterile thing, which is kind of a half truth, honestly. They are self-incompatible, meaning a Bradford pear can't make a seed with another Bradford pear. So if you only have Bradford pears, correct, no viable seeds. But if you have any other Pyrus selection there of different genetics, all of a sudden, boom, you have seeds. So I tell people, imagine you have a neighborhood or a town, isolated town, and everyone only planted Bradford pears. You never have a viable seed because they can't make a viable seed with each other. But it takes that one neighbor, everyone's got one they're not too keen on, to plant a different cultivar, and all of a sudden, you've got pollen that can pollinate everything, and you've got viable seeds all over. They knew this. They also knew how much, how successful this plant was in the horticultural realm, and their response was kind of like, "Well, sorry, it's doing too well to do a whole lot about it." Another wrinkle to all this, because this tree is a grafted cultivar, if there are ever sprouts from the roots, which is not the Bradford part, you can essentially have two trees growing on one root ball, right? And this is what you see in a couple of these pictures from Mike. And you can see there are different phenologies even. One is flowering, one is leafing out, one is already leafed out, and one's still breaking bud. So all of these can make new seeds. At this point in time, honestly, there's zero chance that any Pyrus caloriana you purchase will not make a viable seed. There's just too much of it out there. And so this, of course, is partially why we have wild calorie pear in these old fields, roadsides. It's usually always the first thing that blooms white, the first white blooming tree every spring. Unsold lots. For the longest time, this wasn't considered a forestry pest. It was just something that happened in ditches and old fields. But lo and behold, now we're seeing it all the way down here in our pine stands. All those green understory trees are calorie pear. And you'll even see it in pastures, right? I had a call where this pasture had all these calorie pear bushes there, and this little horse, whose name escapes me, but he kept getting his face completely torn up because he would run through those. You've got Bradford or calorie pear all over the place. It's spread by birds, and this is a great shot of a road near I live. This is a row of Bradford pear trees. Birds fly in there, eat those fruits, poop out the seeds as they fly off across the meadow, and all those new little blobs are new calorie pear trees. So these are extremely invasive, extremely pervasive. Genetics work has shown them to be basically the perfect invasive plant. Right? There are apologists out there, Bradford pear apologists out there, touting the fact that they can be used as a fruit root graft, and they do photosynthesize. And I'll be honest, I don't want to hear any of that. There's nothing good about this tree. Every calorie pear out there is simply taking up the space of a plant that is better. So I don't want to hear any of this. So that being said, now what do we do, right? As invasive species specialist and manager, what do? We figure out how to help people manage or get rid of this plant on their property. So there's lots of different ways you can remove plants, and this all kind of goes into making a management plan. So can you hand pull them? If you get one that's a true seedling, yeah, it'll pop out of the ground. But a lot of times, a lot of these things that look like seedlings are actually sprouts growing off the main root, in which case it's not going to work. Can you cut it and just walk away? If you cut it alone, is that an option? Hard no. Hardwood trees love resprouting. Calorie pear is no different. In fact, this one, which I cut just for the fun of it, ended up putting leaves off that main stem and then rooting on the bottom where it was touching the ground. So super, super reproductive that way. Grazing is a common option for invasive plants. No one's tried it on calorie pear. It might work before the thorns get hard. Remember, these things get thorns that are 2 inches long. No one's tried it. Mechanical control is always an option sometimes, depending on your budget and your cost. Of course, you can dig up a tree. You can mow them, but especially down here in the Southeast with this climate we have, they need to be mowed 2 to 3 times a year. And if you don't, they're going to get too big and they're going to get those hard thorns and they will pop tractor tires and just simply become too large for a bush hog to get through, at which point you need to take an actual mulching head on a bobcat and try to get through there. So it becomes very expensive very quick. What about prescribed fire? Right? We love burning stuff down here in the Southeast. It might work. There's some work out there on other invasive things that shows a hot fire will kill some of these seeds. So maybe that's something that can happen. I've got a PhD student working on that right now. Saplings just resprout like crazy after fire. There's a number of studies out there that show fire alone will not work, right? So in this case, this was up in Indiana. You've got your pre-fire where there's no sprouts and your post-fire 3 to 4 sprouts per individual. Here's another study from Ohio where they actually looked at just simply cutting, using fire alone or freezing these things. In all cases, you got a bunch more resprouts per stem with any of those things. The one that actually worked, herbicide, right? We found in some of our stuff in Georgia between 2 and 12 resprouts per stem every time a fire went over it. So saplings are just going to come back for the most part. Mature trees, no one's really tried it, but honestly, once that bark on a mature hardwood gets kind of corky and corrugated, it's really hard for fire to get through there because it acts as a buffer and insulator. Biocontrol is often discussed with invasive things in general. For plants, one of the main reasons a plant becomes invasive is because nothing eats it, right? And this is the same way. Biocontrol is just not an option. We even looked at does anything even eat calorie pair? Cliff Notes version, not really. We had 3 very, very broad spectrum herbivores: Japanese beetles, tent caterpillars, webworms. We fed them maple, hickory, cherry, and calorie pair, and quite frankly, most of them would rather die than eat the calorie pair. Even when they had no choice whatsoever, they took a bite or two, and then they just sort of crawled around their dish till they died. So calorie pair is not something that's going to get eaten. And even in my years of working with this thing, I've seen maybe a half a dozen different herbivores on there, and in 0 cases were they making any measurable damage on a tree. Which brings us to herbicide, right? I am not a shill for the industry, but if we're being completely honest, herbicide is often your only legitimate effective recourse for dealing with invasive plants. That's just the fact of the matter. Unless you're going to physically dig that thing up, any large scale invasive plant work is going to need herbicides to work. So we've done some of these trials to be able to tell people what can you use and when should you use it to be able to most effectively deal with calorie pair in your landscape. So we did some what we call small tree trials. These were 6 to 8 feet tall. Here's one site, here's another. These are kind of your early infested places. The good news is everything worked, right? We had one case where hexazinone didn't work, and this is simply because when you apply this on the ground, there needs to be rain within a couple of weeks. Of course, we applied it, rain was in the forecast, and then it never happened. And so we didn't get the treatment we wanted. But glyphosate worked, imazapyr worked, triclopyr worked, it's foliar. So you can kill these things. You just have to get out there and do it. After we did this project, we did some larger trees, right? So we've got Ryan here at Kansas, our buddy Ryan Armbrust. So we took trees that were in the sort of 3, 4 to 8 inch DBH range, did some hack and squirt, did some cut stump, tracked these things. More good news, herbicides work for the most part if you do it right. Now, I will say cut stump worked 100% of the time. The hack and squirt, most of the time, that stuff worked really well. And just like before, the hexazinone is variable, and that really, really depends on follow-up rainfall. So that's just one of the things. So the take-home messages for all this is there's no silver bullet for invasive species management. And depending on the pest, your management will look different. Management can differ depending on location. And I think the big take-home I hope people get from today is that there's not a one-size-fits-all thing, and we have to accept this. And we have to do what we can with the resources we have to try to make the best difference, and just acknowledge that in some cases, eradication's off the table. In a lot of cases, eradication's off the table, but we can manage at different levels, and it all gets down to using your resources in the best way possible. So with that, I will take questions. I apologize I wasn't able to look in the chat as we're going, but we can do that now. Bob, did you want to manage those? You want me to stop screen sharing here, buddy?
Go ahead, leave your screen up. Do we have any
All right.
questions for Dave? Because we haven't had any appear in the chat yet. I especially like that you address calorie pair there. I live in an area where there is a lot of calorie pair that has now gotten loose out of its original plantings.
Yeah, it's a mess, and we struggle giving recommendations. There's a lot of people that spend a lot of money trying to get rid of that thing every single year, and it takes a sustained effort to be able to do something with it, and it's really unfortunate.
Thank you for the presentation. This is Tom Peterbaugh. Question: Is European black alder considered to be an invasive? I've seen it as desirable and non-desirable.
That is a species that I rarely hear about as being invasive. So, um, some of these are tough, to be an invasive species, it's got to have a few things. It's got to be not from here, which European black alder is. It's got to have some sort of measurable impact, and I've not worked with it, so I don't know if it has a measurable impact. And there's got to be sustaining populations, which there are, but I don't know. Are there any measured documented impacts of black alder, or is this just folks not liking it? I guess that's kind of the difference, right? If there's a documented impact in some way, shape, or form, then it fits that invasive, category. But if not, then it's just what I would call a non-native.
I'll leave it as a question. Thank you.
Yep.
So we had another question pop up there. One person commented they've had great results with basal bark treatments on autumn olive in northern Indiana, which is not uncommon for treating autumn olive throughout the state. That's a good strategy to use.
Yeah.
Another question, what invasive species are of greatest concern for you right now? Like if you had to pick a few direct management efforts toward over others, which would you select? And they know region impacts that decision.
Yeah, honestly, which are the most concerning now? Honestly, the most concerning are the ones we don't have yet. I think let me back up there. From a plant perspective, gosh, they're all so impactful in their own way. And I think one of the challenges we have with plants like calorie repair and privet and Elaeagnus is they're just so darn widespread. It takes the big challenge is getting people to work together to manage them on larger than my land scales. So that's a big concern. And we do some work trying to get people to manage on a regional scale to try to actually make a dent. Um, Down here in the Southeast, our probably number one forestry crop is pines, and we, knock on wood, don't have any invasive pine pests yet. And that to me is the biggest fear I have, is that there would be some sort of insect or fungal pest that is non-native and becomes invasive that hits our pine that comes in from somewhere. If that would be akin to losing corn in the Midwest. So that is the big fear, is almost the things we don't have yet are kind of the big fears. Asian longhorn beetle, we know what to do there. It just takes time. Emerald ash borer, cat's out of the bag there. That thing's gone. And from a regional perspective, we don't have a lot of ash in the deep south. It's just not nearly as prevalent as it is up north. So laurel wilt is certainly one that's a challenge, but it's, again, cat's out of the bag on that too, and everything's already dead. So I tend to think about, when asked what are my biggest fears, it's the thing we don't have, and it's just the challenge in getting folks to work together on things.
So we've got an interesting question that popped up here. That looking forward to how you answer this one. The person saying I manage city trees in an urban environment, most densely populated city in New England. We don't remove invasive trees unless they're dead or dying, because once we remove them, we may or may not be able to replant the area, and at least they are providing shade. We have large populations of Norway maple and calorie pear, for example. What do you think of this strategy?
Well, it's always challenging because at the end of the day, the dollar often dictates what can be done, right? I personally don't like leaving up non-native trees, because the longer those are up, the more seed they keep producing to keep producing wild invasive things in other places. And I guess that would be my argument against that. I also see why, from a city perspective, you would rather have shade than not shade, and have a tree there. I would, again, I look at it as every year that calorie repair is up is a year those birds are eating those fruits and going and crapping somewhere and making more calorie repair. So to me, the more they stay up, the more they just perpetuate the problem everywhere. But I also understand that if there's no money to replace them, um, from a city perspective, you want that shade. So it's kind of a catch-22, honestly. There's not a great answer unless you can find some more money to replace them. I don't know if I answered or walked around that question without giving an answer, but that's a tricky one when you start dealing with not just the ecological things, right? It's the economic things and the human health things and the need for a particular thing trees make, shade. Sometimes those take precedent over the other stuff.
So our next question is, can you recommend control measures for Tree of Heaven?
Same measures we use for any of those other woody things. You know, if it's big enough, hack and squirt works great. Cut stump is a great method, but then you have the top of the tree to deal with. And that's kind of the, when folks say, which method should I use? It kind of depends. Can you leave that tree standing? If so, hack and squirt that thing is great. If it's a bigger tree, that's going to provide some, habitat for woodpeckers and bats and some of those other things. If it's small enough, you can do the basil bark. If you can scrape that bark and see green, basil bark treatment will work. It kind of just depends on if you're okay leaving a dead tree standing or if it needs to come down. So all of those things work for Atlantis. For smaller Atlantis that maybe are patches, foliar works as well. So it really gets down to the, what can you leave there?
Let's see. Our next question is, given we can't remove all the different species, has there been studies that show if certain invasives may be beneficial to wildlife, and if so, ones that we shouldn't be as active in removing? For example, Japanese knotweed is horrible at covering the understory and spreading along streams. However, it is good for pollinators for late in the summer.
So my argument to people, my argument to the notion that we should leave invasive things for pollinators is that the only reason they appear good for pollinators is because that invasive plant has already snuffed out all the native stuff that could be there. Um, and we hear this a lot for Chinese tallow down here in the southeast. People, some of the beekeeping crowd loves Chinese tallow because you get that tallow honey and it's a good source of flowers. Well, it's only the source of flowers because it's crowded out all the willows and maples already. And I still think, and this is a hill I will die on, that if you remove those invasives, native flowers will still be there. So I don't think, and I don't know of any studies that sort of show that. This is kind of Dave's gut feeling coming in here. I just think that it becomes a land management question. I don't know that the global we can focus on one species. It just depends on who's in charge of that land. But for me, sure, bees will figure out how to use stuff, but if that invasive's not there, there's going to be a native thing that pops up that's just as good for them.
Then the last question we have here is, ground covers, winter creeper, and vinca have become ubiquitous. Effective eradication preferences?
Yeah, admittedly, I don't do a lot with those two species. I just know that when you've got ground covers, foliar application works pretty well. If it's a species with those waxy leaves, you just have to make sure you've got a sticker in there to make sure that's going to stick to those leaves. Sometimes with ground covers like that, it can be really tough because there might be a native plant or two poking up, but it's so hard to avoid those when you're spraying. So you just need to make the decision: am I going to brown earth it and just start over? Or if you can find the source of the vine, you can sometimes treat those just like a cut stump type of thing. So again, it's going to depend on if you can leave dead plants everywhere or if you want to cut stump and get that stuff off and then treat that stump. It just depends on what you're able to leave in that area. But for a lot of those things, there's herbicides work great for all these invasive plants. You just have to use surfactant if you got those waxier leaves to make sure it sticks. Ivy is another one. That English ivy is another one where you have to have a surfactant in there.
All right. Do we have any other questions? I'm not seeing any more. All right. Well, I'm going to say that's good for today. And Dave, thank you so much for donating your time and sharing your knowledge with us. If you have any questions, those of you on YouTube or those who are present live, please feel free to send them to me. I can forward them on to Dave. Other than that, thank you all for coming, and I hope all of you have a great holiday season.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, everybody.